To understand why this matters, you have to understand what kelp forests were to this coastline. Giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrenifera, is one of the fastest-growing organisms on the planet, capable of stretching upward more than 30 centimeters in a single day, building underwater cathedrals that once rivaled the height of the trees in Tasmania's own temperate rainforests. These forests were nurseries for juvenile fish, hunting grounds for seals, shelter for tiny seahorses that exist nowhere else on Earth. They fed a rock lobster fishery and an abalone industry that, combined, have historically generated several $100 million a year for Tasmania's coastal economy. Entire fishing towns on the east coast, places like Bycheal, St. Helens, and Eaglehawk Neck, built their identities around these waters the way wheat towns build their identities around the harvest. Kelp was not scenery here. It was infrastructure, economy, and inheritance, woven into a regional culture shaped as much by the roaring 40s winds and the wild Tasman Sea as by the convict and whaling history that first brought European settlers to this remote edge of the continent. So when researchers began surveying the scale of the loss in the years following Hartley's dive, the numbers landed like a diagnosis nobody wanted to hear. Fishery scientists estimated that the decline in kelp-dependent habitat was contributing to tens of millions of dollars in reduced abalone and rock lobster yields annually, with some East Coast fishing operations reporting catch declines of more than 50% compared to historical baselines. Tourism operators who once advertised kelp forest dives to international visitors just quietly stopped, including those reefs in their brochures. A government already managing the economic aftershocks of a changing climate now faced a new question. How do you put a price on the disappearance of an entire forest that lives underwater, invisible to almost everyone except the people whose livelihoods depend on it? The early investigation, led by researchers connected to the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania, followed the most obvious trail. Every transect line researchers laid across the Barrens told the same story. Wherever kelp forests had collapsed, the seafloor was dominated by a single animal, the long-spined sea urchin, Centrostephanus rogersii, a black needle-spined grazer normally associated with the reefs of New South Wales, hundreds of kilometers to the north. In some barrens, densities reached numbers that made counting almost meaningless. Urchins packed across the rock in concentrations scientists had never documented this far south. Each one was small on its own. Together, they formed something closer to a slow-motion wildfire, grazing down every young kelp plant before it had a chance to mature, leaving the rock permanently scoured and bare. For a brief period, the story seemed solved. A destructive invader had arrived, and it was eating Tasmania's forests into oblivion. Then came the detail that overturned the entire narrative. Centrostephanus rogersii is not an invasive species at all. It is native to Australian waters and has lived along the continent's eastern coastline for longer than anyone has been keeping records. This was not an alien predator crossing into unfamiliar territory. It was a long-time resident of the wider ecosystem, suddenly behaving as though the rules it had always lived by no longer applied. If the urchin had always belonged here, the question shifted from what is destroying this ecosystem to why is something that has coexisted with this coastline for millennia suddenly tearing it apart? The answer required scientists to stop looking at the seafloor and start looking at the ocean itself. Off the eastern coast of Australia runs the East Australian Current, a warm water river within the sea, the same current that carries loggerhead turtles and reef fish southward along the continental shelf. For most of the 20th century, this current pushed warm water only so far before colder southern ocean conditions took over, creating a natural thermal barrier that kept tropical and subtropical species, including young Centrostephanus larvae, from establishing permanent populations in Tasmanian waters. Since the 1940s, but accelerating sharply since the 1990s, the East Australian Current has been extending farther south and carrying warmer water with it. a measurable consequence of broader ocean warming linked to climate change. Layered onto this gradual shift have come increasingly frequent and intense marine heat waves, sudden spikes in sea temperature that can stress kelp directly while creating ideal conditions for urchin larvae to survive the journey south and settle onto Tasmanian reefs in record numbers. The sea urchins, in other words, had not changed. The ocean had changed around them, opening a door that had been closed for thousands of years and inviting them through it. But this still left a puzzle that gnawed at researchers reviewing decades of survey data. Centrostephanus has lived for a very long time on reefs farther north in waters off New South Wales without producing this same scale of total forest collapse. If this urchin had coexisted with kelp ecosystems elsewhere along the coast for so long, something must have kept its populations in check in those older ranges. Whatever that mechanism was, it appeared to be missing, or broken, here in Tasmania. The search for the missing piece led researchers, among them Dr. Scott Ling, whose long-term studies of urchin barrens would eventually become some of the most cited research on this crisis to compare healthy reefs against collapsed ones in painstaking detail. They measured water temperature, they measured kelp density, water clarity, current strength, even the chemical composition of the rock. None of it explained the difference. The reefs that had resisted total collapse and the reefs that had turned to barren stone were, on paper, nearly identical environments. The actual difference, when it finally emerged from the data, seemed almost too modest to matter. It wasn't a chemical, it wasn't a current. It was the presence or absence of large southern rock lobsters, Jasus edwardsi, the same spiny, blue-black lobster that fills the freezers of seafood restaurants from Hobart to Tokyo, the backbone of one of Tasmania's most valuable commercial fisheries. For most people, including many who had fished these waters for generations, that connection seemed almost laughable. The rock lobster was dinner. It was an export commodity, a prized catch hauled up in pots and sold by the kilogram. Nobody had built a conservation narrative around an animal best known for ending up on a plate. And yet the data kept pointing in the same direction. In areas where rock lobster populations were dense and healthy, urchin barrens were rare, patchy, and often temporary. In areas where lobsters had been heavily fished down over decades, barrens spread unchecked. The rock lobster, it turned out, was one of the very few native predators in Tasmanian waters strong enough to attack and consume adult long-spined sea urchins, cracking through their dense spiny armor in a way few other animals could manage. This discovery alone might have been enough for an extraordinary documentary. But the deeper researchers dug, the stranger and more specific the truth became. Not every rock lobster could do this. In controlled feeding trials and field observations, scientists found that only large, mature lobsters, animals that had survived many years without being caught, growing well beyond typical commercial harvest size, possessed claws powerful enough to crush the largest, most dangerous urchins. Smaller, younger lobsters simply could not generate enough force. They might nibble at small urchins, but they were physically incapable of taking down the very individuals capable of founding and sustaining a barren. This was the detail almost everyone had overlooked. Decades of commercial rock lobster fishing in Tasmania had selectively removed the biggest, oldest individuals from the population because those were precisely the lobsters most prized by the market. Fishers were not simply harvesting seafood. Without anyone realizing it, they were quietly removing the reef's only effective check on an urchin population poised to explode the moment ocean conditions allowed. The ecosystem had not lost a species. It had lost its largest individuals, and with them, an entire predator-prey relationship that had likely helped stabilize Australian reefs for thousands of years, since long before European settlement. since long before the first wooden fishing boats put out from Tasmania's eastern bays. The current had shifted. The urchins had arrived in unprecedented numbers, and the one predator capable of holding the line had already been thinned out, gradually, pot by pot, across nearly a century of fishing. Then nature offered something close to an experiment of its own design. Beginning in the early 2000s and expanding through the following 2 decades, a network of marine protected areas was established along sections of the Tasmanian coast, including no-take zones where commercial and recreational fishing were prohibited entirely. Inside these reserves, lobsters were left alone to do what fished populations rarely get the chance to do: simply grow old. Within roughly a decade, researchers monitoring these protected reefs began documenting something remarkable. Lobster density inside the reserves climbed several times higher than in adjacent fished areas, and critically, the average size of individual lobsters increased dramatically, with many growing well past the size threshold needed to crack large urchins. As that size structure shifted, urchin densities inside the reserves began to fall. Barren ground that had sat lifeless for years started showing the first signs of juvenile kelp. Not towering forests yet, not the cathedral canopy Hartley's grandfather remembered, but the unmistakable green stubble of recovery spreading across rock that had been stone bare for the better part of a decade. It would be tempting to end the story here, with the lobster cast as the hero who saved the forest. But researchers studying these recovering reefs kept arriving at a more complicated, more interesting conclusion. The lobster alone was not rebuilding the kelp forest. What was being rebuilt was a relationship, a tightly linked chain connecting ocean currents, water temperature, urchin reproduction, predator size structure, and kelp regrowth. A system shaped by evolutionary pressures stretching back since the end of the last ice age, when these reef communities first began settling into roughly their current form. Climate change had altered one link in that ancient chain. Decades of fishing pressure had weakened another. Individually, either disruption might have been absorbed by a resilient system. Together, compounding across roughly half a century, they had been enough to collapse forests that had stood for millennia in the span of little more than one generation. This reframes the entire crisis. It is easy, and not entirely wrong, to cast the long-spined sea urchin as the visible monster of this story, an organism whose sheer numbers turned thriving reef into stone. But the urchin was never acting outside its nature. It was simply released into conditions that no longer contained it, on a coastline that had quietly lost its strongest natural defense. The true antagonist was never a single species. It was the slow accumulation of human and climatic pressures acting on the same ecosystem from different directions at once, each one seemingly survivable in isolation, devastating in combination. The economic dimension of this realization is striking on its own terms. Restoring urchin barrens through direct human intervention, divers manually culling urchins reef by reef, a method researchers and citizen science groups have indeed used on smaller pilot reefs, can cost government and conservation programs many thousands of dollars per hectare, with broader regional restoration and monitoring programs collectively running into the tens of millions of dollars when scaled across Tasmania's affected coastline. Compare that to what a single recovering population of large rock lobsters can do for free, removing urchins continuously, year after year, simply by existing at the size and density nature intended. A government spending heavily to manually clear urchins from isolated reefs is, in a very real sense, replicating, at enormous cost, a service that an intact predator population once provided as a permanent feature of the ecosystem, no funding application required. The scale of what is at stake here keeps widening the longer you look at it. This story began with one diver's flashlight beam, catching nothing but bare rock on one reef near Eaglehawk Neck. It expanded to encompass hundreds of kilometers of Tasmania's eastern coastline. From there, it stretched across the full extent of the Great Southern Reef, a connected temperate reef system running more than 8,000 kilometers along Australia's southern coastline, supporting an estimated annual economic contribution in the billions of dollars through fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection, and home to levels of marine biodiversity found almost nowhere else on the planet, much of it found only in these particular waters and nowhere else on Earth. What looked in 2019 like a localized and strange discovery on one Tasmanian reef has become recognized as one of the most significant temperate marine ecosystem shifts driven by climate change anywhere in the southern hemisphere. And the story is still being written. Marine heat waves continue to strike this coastline with increasing frequency, some pushing water temperatures high enough to stress kelp directly, regardless of what is happening with urchins. Long-spined sea urchin larvae continue arriving on the southward current from the north, season after season, probing reefs that have not yet been protected. In some bays, recovering lobster populations are holding the line, kelp slowly reclaiming stone that sat barren for a decade. In others, urchin densities remain too high, lobsters too scarce or too small, and the barrens persist, stubborn and silent, waiting. Researchers are now asking a question that extends well beyond Tasmania. If restoring one forgotten predator-prey relationship between a clawed crustacean most people only ever see on a dinner plate and a spiny grazer, most people will never see at all, can bring measurable life back to a reef many had quietly written off as lost, what does that suggest about ecosystems collapsing in other oceans, under other warming currents, with other quiet imbalances no one has yet traced back to their source? How many other recoveries are waiting? Not on some dramatic new technology or untested intervention, but on the patient, unglamorous work of simply letting an old, unfinished relationship between predator and prey grow back to its natural size. Nobody studying these reefs is claiming victory. The forests that once rivaled Tasmania's own temperate rainforests in scale have not returned to anything close to what they were before this collapse began. What has returned, in patches, is something more modest and in some ways more important. Evidence that the system is not beyond repair. That given the right conditions, the relationships that built this ecosystem over thousands of years can begin rebuilding themselves, reef by reef, lobster by lobster, frond by frond. Jaden Hartley still dives those waters. He has watched some of the barrens near his home reef begin, slowly, unevenly, to soften at the edges, threads of new kelp pushing up through rock that had been stripped bare for years. He says it is too early to call it a forest again. But for the first time in a long time, when he drops below the surface and his light sweeps the seafloor, it is no longer catching nothing at all. The current is still warming. The urchins are still arriving. The lobsters are still growing, reef by reef, year by year, inside the boundaries humans drew to give them room. Nature has not finished answering the question this coastline has been asking since the day the kelp first began to vanish. Whether the forests return, whether the balance holds, whether this fragile, ancient relationship between predator and prey can outpace a warming ocean, that story is still unfolding beneath the surface, in real time on a coastline that has not yet decided how it ends.